Have you ever had a neighbor try to tear down something that was 100% yours, only to find out you're the one holding all the cards? This is the story of the day. An HOA Karen demanded I rip out my fence without knowing I'm the city surveyor who set the property lines in the first place. Stick around, hit that like button, subscribe for more real-life showdowns, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I heard the knock. Not the polite kind you give a neighbor when you're borrowing sugar, but the loud, sharp, rapid-fire kind that makes you instantly know something's wrong. I opened the door to find her, Karen from 3 houses down, standing with her sunglasses perched like she was about to issue a parking ticket. Her lips were pursed so tightly I thought they might disappear entirely. Before I could even say hello, she jabbed a finger toward my backyard and launched into it. "That fence you put up is in violation of HOA regulations," she said with the tone of a school principal catching you with gum in your mouth. "You'll need to take it down immediately." I blinked, partly from the absurdity of the demand, and partly because I was still on my first cup of coffee. I told her calmly that the fence was not only within my property line, but was actually built according to the official city survey. She smirked like I had just told her I built it according to fairy dust and unicorn law. "I've already filed a complaint with the HOA board," she said, "and if you don't comply, you'll be fined." I almost laughed, but managed to hold it in. This wasn't my first run-in with an overzealous neighbor. But she didn't know yet that I was the city surveyor who had personally marked the boundaries she was so confidently claiming were wrong. I asked if she'd like to see the property map, and she waved her hand as though swatting away an annoying fly. "I don't need to see your papers," she replied. "I know where the property line is. And your fence is too far forward." I studied her face and realized she genuinely believed she was in the right. That was going to make this interesting. She turned on her heel and walked away without giving me a chance to respond. I stood in the doorway listening to her heels click against the sidewalk, the sound echoing like a challenge. I stepped back inside and set my coffee down, mentally shifting from weekend relaxation to battle mode. The thing about people like Karen is they thrive on assuming everyone else will just give in to avoid drama. Unfortunately for her, I'm not wired that way. That afternoon I saw her in her driveway talking to 2 other neighbors, gesturing wildly toward my yard. I could tell from their sideways glances that I was the subject. I decided to stroll over, paperwork in hand. And as I approached, I caught the tail end of her sentence. "He's just trying to get away with it because he thinks no one will notice." I handed her a copy of the official survey map and pointed to the clear measurements that proved the fence was well within bounds. She didn't even glance at it, just crossed her arms and repeated the same line. "The HOA rules are the rules. You can't just ignore them." I told her calmly that HOA rules cannot override city property boundaries and that I'd be happy to explain that to the board. She scoffed, telling me good luck with that, and walked off again. That evening I got an email from the HOA. The subject line read, "Immediate violation notice." According to them, Karen had filed a formal complaint, and a fine would be assessed if the fence wasn't removed in 2 weeks. I shook my head, partly in disbelief, partly in anticipation. This was going to get messy, but in the most satisfying way possible. I sat down at my desk and began gathering everything I'd need. The original deed, the recorded survey, photographs of the fence before and after construction, permits, emails from the city. If they wanted a fight, I was bringing facts instead of volume. The next morning, Karen was out walking her dog when she saw me by the fence inspecting one of the corner stakes. She stopped just outside my property and asked in that saccharine voice people use when they're pretending to be nice, "Are you finally taking it down?" I told her no, just making sure the lines I set are still right where they should be. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. Just pulled her dog along like she was yanking a stubborn child. Inside, I could feel the clock ticking toward the upcoming HOA meeting. I knew exactly what was going to happen. She'd make a big scene, try to rally the room against me, and hope peer pressure would do what her threats hadn't. But this was my arena. I'd surveyed properties in worse disputes than this, and I never lost. 2 nights later, I saw her car idling in front of my house for a good 3 minutes before pulling away. I had no idea what that was about. But it told me she was still thinking about the fence. Still convinced she could win. I couldn't decide if it was amusing or sad. Maybe both. That weekend, I caught my neighbor Tim in his front yard, and he quietly told me Karen had been going door to door, asking people to sign a petition against me. She was telling everyone my fence was a hazard to the neighborhood aesthetic. Whatever that meant. Tim said he refused to sign. But a few people had agreed just to avoid the hassle. That was exactly her tactic. By Sunday night, I had everything printed, highlighted, and clipped neatly in a folder. My plan wasn't just to defend the fence, but to make sure everyone in that room understood exactly why her complaint was not only baseless, but borderline harassment. She might think she was dealing with just another resident, but she was about to realize she had picked the worst possible person to accuse of misplacing a boundary line. The night before the meeting, I walked the perimeter one more time with my measuring wheel, double-checking every inch just for my own satisfaction. Each click of the wheel felt like another nail in the coffin of her argument. When I finished, I stood there for a moment, looking at the fence, solid and unshakable, like the truth I was about to lay out. She had no idea yet. But the battle she thought she was winning was already over. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 7, and by Monday morning, the neighborhood buzz had shifted from idle gossip to organized whispers. That hushed tone people use when they want to be heard but also want plausible deniability. I took my coffee to the porch and watched as Karen marched from mailbox to mailbox, with a stack of printed notices tucked under her arm. She was dressed like she was headed to court in a crisp blouse and neat slacks, and her walk had the all-business energy of someone who has rehearsed every line. She paused at my box just long enough to slide a sheet inside, and then glanced at me like she was dropping off a subpoena. I lifted my mug in a friendly half-wave. She did not wave back. She pivoted and kept marching. I let her go and finished my coffee before retrieving the notice. It was a letter written in formal language that tripped over itself trying to sound official. It said my fence violated setback aesthetics and line-of-sight principles of the neighborhood plan. It urged immediate removal to avoid penalties, and it concluded with a paragraph urging neighbors to preserve community harmony by discouraging non-compliance. There was no signature other than Community Standards Committee. I knew the committee was Karen and her two friends who liked to police Halloween decorations. I brought the notice inside and added it to the growing file on my desk. I took a photo of the envelope and the timestamp, and then sent a quick email to the HOA address, acknowledging receipt and requesting the exact covenant language they believed applied. No sarcasm, no heat. Just a clean request that I copied to my personal account and to the city address I used for records so I could keep a trail. When you deal with people who love rules, you let them feel fenced in by their own. By noon, Karen had posted in the neighborhood social page. Tim sent me a screenshot. It read as a call to action to defend the neighborhood's common charm from inappropriate structures and went on to suggest that bad actors were exploiting loopholes. It did not name me, but 3 comments in someone posted a zoomed photo of my fence from the street with a caption that said, "This is what we are talking about." I wanted to be angry, but found myself more curious than upset. People who rely on indignation often mistake volume for substance. I decided to spend the afternoon documenting every detail of the build. I measured the grade along the property edge, took high-resolution photos of each corner stake, and pulled the engineer's level from my shop to record a cross-slope note. I even filmed a clean walkthrough with the measuring wheel clicking in even meters. I did not share any of it yet, I just wanted it ready. That evening, while I grilled chicken in the backyard, I heard Karen's voice float over the hedge. She was standing by the sidewalk speaking loudly into her phone about violations and precedent. I let the sizzle of the grill be the only answer and plated my dinner. Halfway through, my phone buzzed with an email from the HOA. It was a polite confirmation of the upcoming hearing, with a request that I refrain from modifying the fence before the meeting. That last line made me smile. It told me they knew the case rested on the fence being exactly where it was. I responded with a yes and attached a copy of the recorded survey with the stamp visible. I also added a single sentence noting that as the licensed city surveyor who performed the measurement, I welcomed any third-party review. I did not sound triumphant. I sounded professional. The next morning I noticed a small orange flag near the curb in front of my hedge. It was the kind utility companies use to mark lines, but the imprint was generic. 2 houses down, I saw Karen crouched near another yard, placing a twin flag. She straightened when she noticed me watching and called out that the committee was identifying property limits for the hearing. I walked over slowly and asked whose data she was using. She said common sense. I held back a laugh. I told her gently that placing flags to imply property lines without a legal basis could confuse people and create liability. She crossed her arms and said the committee had discretion. I told her the city had statutes. We looked at each other for a moment, and I saw the flicker of uncertainty slip across her eyes before the resolve slid back into place. She told me I had 2 days to remove the fence or face fines escalating weekly. I asked her to put that claim in writing with the specific bylaw. She muttered that she would and stormed off. Around lunch, I drove to the municipal records office to print a certified copy of the recorded plat and grab some blank affidavits for neighbor statements. On my way out, I stopped by the engineering division to say hello to Renee, who handled right-of-way requests. Renee raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the HOA rumblings and said to keep it tidy. We do not need a YouTube saga over a garden fence. I told him that if it became a saga, it would at least have accurate measurements. He laughed and told me to invite him to the premiere. When I returned home, a white SUV idled in front of my house. A woman stepped out with a clipboard and a bright smile that did not reach her eyes. She introduced herself as a compliance consultant retained by the HOA for educational purposes. I invited her onto the sidewalk but not the yard. She began reciting general suggestions for harmonious property lines that sounded like they were written by a marketing team that once glanced at a zoning pamphlet. I asked her whether she had reviewed the city plat. She said she had not, but that in similar neighborhoods, a 6-foot fence situated near a corner could impede visibility for drivers. I told her my property was not on a corner, and the fence was behind the line that defined the yard as private. She checked her clipboard and made a note as if I had confessed something significant. She asked if she could step in to measure the setback. I told her she could as soon as she produced a written permission request from the HOA with the cited covenant. She said she would return with that. I said I looked forward to it. She got into her SUV and drove to Karen's house, where she parked and went inside. By late afternoon, my phone had collected a handful of texts from neighbors. Some were supportive. One said, Karen claimed I had fast-tracked my own permit using inside connections. I took a deep breath and called Tim. We met on the sidewalk by the rosemary bush, and I told him the truth. I do not fast-track anything. I do it by the book because the book protects everyone. He nodded and said most folks believed me, but a few people liked the drama more than the facts. He asked if I needed anything. I asked him for a simple statement confirming that the fence had been built exactly where the contractor marked according to my stakes. He agreed, and I handed him a blank affidavit. That night the committee letter arrived. It was a stern directive written on HOA letterhead stating that failure to remove the fence in 48 hours would result in fines and a lien process. It cited a bylaw about uniform sightlines that I recognized as a landscaping guideline meant for hedges. I drafted a response that explained the difference between landscaping guidelines and legal boundaries, and attached 3 documents that showed the official lines. I also included a respectful note advising the committee to refrain from suggesting liens without legal counsel. I sent the email to the board, and blind copied my city account for record keeping. Then I closed my laptop and walked the dog under a sky that smelled like rain. The following morning I woke to a soft drizzle and found fresh chalk marks on the sidewalk by my driveway. They traced a wobbly line that ran several inches into my yard and ended with a big letter K. I did not need a detective to interpret it. I took photos and then sprayed the marks off with the hose. As the water dissolved the chalk, I thought about how quickly a small conflict can tempt people to trade truth for a feeling of control. I set the hose down and decided to invite the board to a site visit before the hearing. A friendly one. No grandstanding. Just measurements in daylight. I sent the invitation and offered to bring extra copies of the plat. At noon, the compliance consultant returned with Karen and one board member named Joel, who liked to play peacemaker at block parties. I greeted them and kept my tone steady. The consultant said they were here to perform a preliminary assessment. I told her I appreciated the effort and asked whether they were prepared to accept the measurement produced by a licensed surveyor. She said they would consider it as one factor. I nodded and produced my measuring wheel and engineer's level. We walked to the rear corner stake, and I showed them the rebar cap stamped with the survey coordinates. The consultant peered at it like she was trying to read a foreign language. Karen stood with arms tight across her chest. Joel leaned in and asked me to walk him through the line. I did. We followed it from stake to stake and then to the fence posts which sat comfortably inside the line. Joel asked how much inside. I gave him the measurement to the 1/4 inch. He nodded slowly and said that sounded clear. Karen jumped in to say the neighborhood guidelines included an aesthetic buffer. I asked to see that clause. She said it was implied by the maintenance section. I told her implication is not enforcement. Joel cleared his throat and said the hearing would be the correct place to finalize. I agreed and added that I had recorded today's visit for my notes. After they left, I received an email from Joel asking if I would share my license number and the date of the survey. I sent both and attached the scanned stamp. I also added a line inviting any licensed third party to verify at my expense if that would settle the matter. A few minutes later, he replied with a thanks and a note that he would circulate the documents to the board. No reply from Karen. By evening, the drizzle had passed and the air felt scrubbed clean. I made pasta and sat at the table with my folder open. I reviewed the survey again, even though I knew it by heart, and rehearsed the short version of my story. Keep it simple. The fence sits inside the property line. The permit was filed and approved. The build met the code. The HOA cannot erase a city plat with a landscaping clause. I pictured the hearing room and the semicircle of folding chairs and the hum of a ceiling fan and the scrape of someone shifting their seat. I imagined Karen speaking first with that crisp voice and the consultant adding buzzwords. I imagined myself standing with the measuring wheel resting lightly by my leg and a single packet of documents for each board member. I felt the small surge of calm that always comes when the variables shrink to facts, and the facts are on your side. Just before bed, I stepped outside with a flashlight and traced the fence line one last time. The beam caught the smooth grain of the wood and the neat line of concrete footings and the corner post that lined perfectly with the capped rebar beneath the soil. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere a television murmured, and a dog barked twice and then stopped. I thought about how many times I had stood in empty lots with a tripod and a faded cap watching the sun slide down while numbers settled into place. Lines are not just lines. They are agreements that let people live next to each other without losing sleep. I clicked the flashlight off and went back inside with a steady breath. In the morning, I found a final message from the HOA, confirming the agenda for Thursday and reminding all parties to keep comments respectful. It also included a line that the board would entertain expert testimony regarding property boundaries. I could almost hear Joel's voice in that sentence. I replied with appreciation and stated that I would present the official plat and my measurement logs. As I pressed send, my phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of my fence taken at twilight with a caption that said, "Last chance." The number was blocked and the photo was grainy, but the sidewalk line and the hedge made it clear whose perspective it was. I stared at it for a moment and then filed it away with the rest. Fear thrives when you respond to it with more fear. I responded to it with documentation. I set the phone down and poured a fresh cup of coffee and felt the steady heartbeat of preparation in my chest. The hearing would come soon enough. For now, I had work to do and a fence that did not need defending so much as it needed a room full of adults willing to listen. Thursday evening came faster than I expected, and by the time I pulled into the community center lot, the sun was already sinking behind the row of pines along the west side of the street. The building itself was one of those brick rectangles built in the 70s, with a single glass door and a faded sign welcoming residents. I parked near the back and took a moment to breathe before grabbing my folder and the measuring wheel from the passenger seat. Inside, I could already hear the low rumble of voices and the scrape of chairs. When I walked into the meeting room, every eye turned. Karen was seated at the far end of a long table, with two of her committee members flanking her like a courtroom team. The rest of the board sat in folding chairs along the other side, and behind them a small crowd of neighbors had gathered. I saw Tim near the back giving me a nod. I took an open seat near the front, but off to the side, close enough to be heard without sitting directly across from Karen. The board president, a tall man named Greg, with glasses and a calm voice, called the meeting to order. After the formalities, he announced that the first agenda item was a property line and fence dispute between two residents. Karen immediately sat straighter, a folder in front of her, and a printed stack of papers at the ready. Greg invited her to speak first. Karen began with a speech about community harmony and visual uniformity, emphasizing that the neighborhood guidelines existed to prevent what she called creeping non-conformity. She held up photos of my fence taken from different angles and pointed to what she claimed was an encroachment on the sidewalk view. She said the placement violated the spirit of the HOA's vision plan. At one point, she looked directly at me and said some residents think they are above the rules because of their jobs. A few heads turned in my direction. When she finished the compliance, consultant stood and recited a series of recommendations about setback consistency. It was polished, but vague. She admitted she had not reviewed the official city survey, but suggested the board consider aesthetic factors beyond pure legality. The room murmured softly. Greg thanked them and turned to me. I stood, walked to the front with my folder and measuring wheel, and began simply. The fence in question sits entirely within my property line, as defined by the recorded city plat. I placed a certified copy on the table for each board member and another on the easel beside me. I pointed out the stamped coordinates and explained in plain terms how the line was established. I made it clear I was not asking for an exception but for recognition of the legal boundary. I explained that before construction I had filed a permit to mark the line myself, and had it verified by a colleague to ensure accuracy. I showed photos of the rebar stakes and the measurements from each point to the fence posts. I kept my tone even, not rising to match the heat in Karen's earlier speech. When Joel asked for the exact distance from the fence to the property line, I answered to the quarter-inch. Karen tried to interject about the aesthetic buffer, but Greg held up a hand and told her she'd have a chance to respond after my presentation. I went on to explain the difference between HOA guidelines for landscaping and the legal status of a property line. I acknowledged the HOA's role in preserving neighborhood character, but reminded them that city code supersedes HOA preference when it comes to surveyed boundaries. I could see a few board members flipping through the plat copies and whispering. One of them asked if the city had approved the fence placement. I confirmed it and produced the signed permit along with the inspection approval from the final walkthrough. I also presented the affidavit Tim had signed, verifying the build was done according to the staked lines. When I finished, Greg turned back to Karen for her rebuttal. She said that even if the fence was technically inside the property line, it was still too close to the sidewalk and created an unfriendly visual barrier. She insisted the board had authority to enforce a removal on aesthetic grounds. Joel asked her to point to the exact bylaw that allowed overriding a legal property boundary. She hesitated, flipped through her pages, and finally read from a section about general maintenance and appearance. Joel frowned and said that section addressed condition of structures, not placement. A man from the back stood and asked if this meant the board could force anyone to move something even if it was on their property. Greg reminded him to direct questions through the chair, but his point had landed. The room felt a little different now, more curious than combative. I took the opportunity to offer a compromise that I knew would underline the reasonableness of my stance. I said that if the board felt a visual adjustment was necessary, I would be open to adding landscaping along the outer side of the fence to soften the look while keeping it in place. It was not an admission of fault, just a gesture. Greg nodded at that. Karen's mouth tightened. After another 10 minutes of back and forth, the board moved to close public comment and deliberate. They stepped into the small office off the main room, while the rest of us waited. Tim wandered over and whispered that half the room was impressed with the paperwork and the calm delivery. I thanked him and stayed seated, measuring wheel leaning against my chair like a quiet witness. When the board returned, Greg announced that they had reviewed the documents and determined the fence was within legal property boundaries and did not violate any enforceable HOA covenant. There would be no removal required. He added that the board encouraged both parties to work toward a mutually agreeable visual solution. That last part was a polite nod to Karen. The applause was light but real. A couple of neighbors patted me on the shoulder as they left. Karen gathered her papers without looking at me and left quickly with the consultant trailing behind. Joel stopped to thank me for providing such thorough documentation and said it made the decision straightforward. I walked out into the cool night air, feeling the weight lift. Not the weight of the fence fight itself, but the heaviness of being publicly accused of bending the rules. In my work, trust is currency, and keeping it clean matters. I put the folder in the passenger seat and sat for a moment, listening to the quiet lot. As I started the car, I saw Karen's SUV parked 2 rows away. She was in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead. For a brief second, our eyes met in the reflection of her side mirror. I gave a small nod and pulled out. She did not follow. On the drive home, I thought about the irony. She had tried to tear down something that stood exactly where it should. And in doing so, she'd only cemented it further. The board's decision meant that unless I chose to move it, the fence would stand for years untouched. When I got back to the house, I walked the perimeter one last time that night, touching the posts and the smooth panels. It wasn't about the wood or the concrete footings anymore. It was about the principle that lines mean something, agreements mean something, and if you're going to challenge them, you'd better bring more than volume. Inside, I set the folder on my desk but didn't file it away just yet. Something told me this wasn't over. People like Karen don't let go easily. They retreat, they regroup, and they wait for another angle. I wasn't worried, just aware and ready. The morning after the meeting, the neighborhood felt oddly still. Like the air after a summer storm when the leaves are wet and nothing moves. I expected to see Karen out walking her dog early as usual, but the street was empty. I made my coffee, sat on the porch, and let the steam rise into the cool air. I kept thinking about the way she had left the meeting. Papers clutched tight, eyes fixed ahead. Losing in front of a crowd doesn't sit well with someone who builds their identity on winning small battles. I knew that for her. Last night wasn't an ending. It was a pause. By mid-morning, I was in my office going through some municipal maps when an email popped into my inbox from the HOA address. It was short and formal, thanking me for my cooperation and stating the matter was considered closed. I smiled at that. On paper, maybe it was over. In reality, I knew there would be ripples. Karen had invested too much social energy into this fight to simply walk away. Around noon, I heard voices outside and glanced through the blinds. Karen was in her driveway speaking to 2 neighbors I didn't know well. Her gestures were broad, her voice carrying just enough to reach my porch if I stepped outside. I stayed put, listening. Words like favoritism and city buddy floated in. She was trying to reframe the loss into something that let her keep her status. Later in the afternoon, I walked to the mailbox and found a small white envelope with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of an article about property disputes escalating into lawsuits. No note, no signature, just the article. I turned it over, looked for any mark that might identify the sender, and found nothing. I wasn't rattled. But I didn't ignore it either. I added it to the file with a date and photo. That evening, Tim stopped by on his way back from walking his dog. He said a few people had asked if I was going to sue Karen for harassment. I laughed and told him no. I had no interest in dragging this through court unless it crossed a real line. He shook his head and said he thought she might be looking for one. Some people can't stand a closed door. The next couple of days were quiet. I kept busy with work, spending hours in the field checking subdivision markers and reviewing plats. It was almost enough to make me forget about the fence entirely. Then on Friday morning, I noticed something strange. The small rebar stake at the far rear corner of my property was leaning. I walked over and saw that the soil around it had been disturbed, like someone had tugged at it and then pushed it back in. It would take effort to do that without pulling it out entirely. I crouched, snapped a photo, and reset it firmly. That night, I installed a motion-activated camera on the back corner of the house facing the property line. Not because I was afraid, but because I liked facts. If someone was messing with the stakes, I wanted proof. Saturday morning, the footage showed nothing unusual. I made breakfast, read the paper, and thought maybe I was overthinking it. But that afternoon, while I was in the garage, I heard the faint metallic clink of something hitting rebar. I stepped outside quietly and saw a shadow moving along the far side of the hedge. By the time I got around the corner, there was no one there. Just the faint swish of branches. The stake was still upright. That night, the camera caught movement again. A figure in a hooded sweatshirt stopped near the corner for less than 5 seconds before moving on. The quality wasn't good enough to make out a face, but the height and build were familiar. I saved the clip and marked the time. On Monday morning, I received a letter from the HOA in the same formal style as before. Only this time it was about a new complaint. It stated that a resident had reported unsafe obstructions near the property edge and requested that I clear any debris within 3 feet of the sidewalk. I knew exactly where this was going. The only thing near the sidewalk was the hedge and the fence behind it. I drafted a short reply attaching a photo of the unobstructed walkway and reminding them that my property maintenance was in compliance with both city and HOA standards. By midweek, Karen was at it again on the neighborhood page, posting a vague update about ongoing efforts to keep the community safe from hazards. She didn't name me, but included a photo of a completely different fence in another part of town as an example of what we should avoid. It was petty, but I could see the strategy. She wanted to chip away slowly, to create a narrative that kept me under suspicion. I refused to take the bait. Instead, I doubled down on being visible in ways that showed I cared about the neighborhood. I joined the Saturday cleanup crew, brought coffee for volunteers, and spent an afternoon helping the guy across the street fix his gate. People notice that sort of thing. They also notice when someone else avoids those opportunities. One evening, as I was trimming the rosemary along the front walk, Karen stopped on the sidewalk. She didn't speak at first, just watched me for a few seconds. Then she said in a flat tone that she hoped I was enjoying my little victory. I told her it wasn't a victory. It was just the truth winning out. She frowned and said the truth is a matter of perspective. I told her not when it's measured to the quarter inch. She didn't like that. She turned and walked off without another word. A few days later, I found another chalk mark on the sidewalk. This one further back from the curb and shaped like an arrow pointing toward my fence. I photographed it before rinsing it away. I added it to the file, which by now was thick enough to fill half a drawer. It was around this time that I started thinking about the deeper reason she was so fixated. It wasn't really about the fence. The fence was just the most visible thing she could attach her frustration to. People who need control will find something to wrap their hands around. And once they do, they squeeze. I decided I wouldn't confront her directly again unless absolutely necessary. Instead, I would keep documenting, keep my yard in perfect shape, and keep living my life. That way, when the next complaint came, and I could meet it with the same steady wall of facts. One night after dinner, I walked the property line again, flashlight in hand, checking each stake. The air was cool and quiet. My beam lit the smooth panels of the fence, the neat row of hedges, the gravel edging by the back gate, everything exactly as it should be. I stood there for a moment, feeling that small satisfaction that comes when you know your work is solid and your ground is secure. From somewhere down the street, I heard a car door slam, then tires crunching on gravel. The sound faded into the night. I clicked off the flashlight and went back inside. In the back of my mind, I could still feel the tension humming, not loud, but steady. This wasn't over. But for now, the fence stood, and so did I. It started on a sunny Saturday, when the street felt like a stage, and everyone had taken a seat without admitting they were watching. I was hauling bags of mulch from the truck when Karen appeared at the curb with a bright yellow tape measure in one hand and a clipboard in the other. She had a man with her in a paint-splattered cap who introduced himself as a contractor in the most casual voice possible, while eyeing my fence like it owed him money. Karen announced that the committee would be conducting a measurement for community clarity. I told her community clarity sounded great and that I was happy to witness any lawful measurement taken from proper reference points. She wrinkled her nose at the phrase proper reference points like the words had a taste she did not like. The contractor popped the tape measure and let the blade snap out with a showy flick. Neighbors started appearing as if the breeze had blown them in. Tim walked over with his dog and stood a little back. 2 teenagers leaned against their bikes. Across the street, Joel drifted out of his garage with a coffee mug and a diplomatic smile that said he hoped no one ruined his weekend. Karen announced the start like a tour guide. "We will begin at the sidewalk and measure back." I told her calmly that the sidewalk was not the legal control she thought it was. She ignored me and told the contractor to set 0 at the curb. He crouched and pressed the hook to the concrete and began to stretch the tape across my hedge toward the fence. I set the mulch down and walked to the corner stake in the grass. I crouched and brushed away a thin crust of soil to reveal the rebar cap and the stamped numbers that tied it to the recorded plat. I spoke clearly so the group could hear. Property boundaries are established by control monuments and their coordinates on the recorded plat, not by the face of a curb or the edge of a sidewalk. If you measure from a reference that is not on the plat, you are measuring a feeling. Karen rolled her eyes and told the contractor to keep going. He reached the fence and read off a number that sounded big enough to cause doubt to anyone who did not know better. Karen lifted her clipboard and announced that the fence was too close by a margin that sounded like a verdict. I asked if I could borrow the free end of the tape. She hesitated but handed it over in a way that suggested she was confident I could not change what was already certain in her mind. I walked the free end to the rebar cap and set the hook against the metal. Then I asked the contractor to bring the tape along the line between this stake and the next stake at the back, not across the grass, not across the hedge, on the line. He looked at Karen. She said fine. He followed me with the tape and I guided him to the second monument. I set the hook and showed Joel the stamp on that cap as well. Now we have a straight baseline that matches the plat. I said, but your fence is not along that exact line. Karen insisted, you are absolutely right. I said, it is inside of it. I slid a long string line from my pocket and clipped it to the front stake. Then I pulled it tight to the rear stake until it hummed. I asked him to confirm the string lay cleanly across the tops of both caps. He knelt, looked, and nodded. The contractor measured from the string to the nearest fence post. When he read off the distance, Joel exhaled softly. It was inside the line by more than an inch. I had said a quarter-inch before because that was the smallest tolerance that mattered in the hearing. The full clearance was a neat cushion that made the point undeniable. Karen said the tape could be sagging. I nodded and offered to fix that. I asked her to hold the zero end herself. She hesitated again, and then stepped forward. I guided her hand and had the contractor hold the other end at elbow height. I pulled the tape gently to take out the sag and repeated the measurement. The number did not change in the way that would serve her. She stared at the blade like it had betrayed her. The teenagers whispered. She pivoted to aesthetics. Even if it is inside, it looks wrong. The neighborhood has a look. I agreed that neighborhoods have looks and that I liked ours. I offered again to plant softening shrubs along the public side. She said shrubs would not fix overreach. I told her overreach was accusing people of violations after the board had already closed the case. A small current moved through the group at that. Joel cleared his throat and thanked everyone for being civil. Karen suddenly pointed at the rebar cap and said she did not trust it. She asked how anyone could be sure the stake had not been moved. I let the question hang for a beat and then reached into my folder. I had printed photos from the day I set the line, and from the day of construction, and from last week after someone had wiggled the stake. I passed them to Joel and then to the contractor. The tops of the stakes showed the same weathering and the same stamp orientation. I pointed out the witness distance to the fence post, which matched across the photos. For good measure, I took out a small level and set it along the string to show the slope correction was negligible for the short span we were discussing. Karen folded her arms and said that the camera footage I hinted at earlier was an invasion of privacy. I told her the camera faced my property and captured only what crossed into my yard or the public way. She looked past me at the eave where the camera sat like a quiet eye. She said she wanted a police officer to confirm the legality right now. Joel said if it would calm things, he could call the non-emergency line. I told him I did not mind. While we waited, I took a moment to talk quietly to the contractor. I told him I respected anyone who worked with their hands and that I knew he had been brought here to play a part he probably did not sign up for. He shrugged and said he liked getting paid but did not like getting stuck between neighbors. I told him that if he ever needed a proper layout for a job, I would gladly mark it for him at standard rates. He cracked a small smile and said he might take me up on that. The patrol car rolled in slow and steady. The officer was a middle-aged man with a calm posture. He stepped out and asked what we had. Joel gave a quick summary. Karen spoke fast and pointed at the fence. The officer listened without interrupting and then turned to me. I explained the monuments and the plat and the board decision. I showed the certified copy and my license. He nodded and said he could not adjudicate property lines, but he could speak to trespass and disturbing markers. He looked at the stake and then at the footprints in the damp soil around it. He asked if anyone had permission to enter my yard to adjust stakes. I said no. He looked at Karen. She said none of this would be necessary if rules were followed. He wrote something in his notebook and said the rules include not entering a yard you do not own. He advised everyone to keep distance and take disputes back to the board. The group settled. The officer left. Karen did not move. She stared at the string line as if it had been set out just to mock her. Then she said she would be filing a new complaint for obstruction and sightline issues because the fence was taller than she liked. I told her the code allowed 6 feet and that the fence measured under that even on the high side of the slope. She said she would bring a new tape and measure again. I said she could bring a marching band if she wanted. Facts would not change to match a beat. Joel gently suggested we end the demonstration. Tim quietly unclipped the string and handed it back to me. The teenagers wheeled away on their bikes, making a show of how not interested they had been. The contractor folded his tape in a slow, deliberate way as if buying time. Karen lifted her clipboard and turned to go. Before she left, she said, "I hoped you enjoyed the show." I told her I did not enjoy any of this. I just respected the line. After the crowd thinned, I stayed in the yard, coiling the string and wiping the tape with a rag even though it did not need it. The small actions steadied me. Tim lingered and asked if I was all right. I said I was and thanked him for standing by. He shrugged and said he liked facts and he liked fences that did what they were built to do. He added that a few neighbors who had been unsure were now solidly in my corner. I told him that was never my aim, but I was grateful anyway. An hour later, Karen posted on the neighborhood page. The tone was righteous and careful. She did not name me, but everyone knew. She used phrases like greater good and vigilance and community standards. In the comments, a handful of people cheered her on. More people asked to see the plat. Joel posted a note saying the board had reviewed the issue and that any further complaints should be supported by specific covenant references and evidence. He thanked everyone for their patience. The thread slowed. That evening, I rolled the measuring wheel along the line one more time and wrote the numbers in my notebook out of habit. The sky was sliding toward purple, and the warm air carried the scent of cut grass from 2 blocks over. I thought about how fragile trust could be in a neighborhood, and how a strip of wood and concrete could become a referendum on the way people treat each other. I also thought about how simple it really was. There is a line. We agree on it. We live. Just after sunset, a white SUV crept past my house and paused at the corner. The brake lights held. Then the car moved on. I watched it go without moving. The camera watched with me. I did not want a war. I wanted quiet and good mornings on the sidewalk and neighbors who borrowed tools and returned them with thanks. But if a war was the only language someone understood, I could speak it in measurements and dates and photos that made the case without raising my voice. I locked the gate and put the tools away. In the kitchen, I set water to boil for pasta and leaned against the counter while the burner clicked to life. My phone buzzed. Joel had sent a text that read, "Keep all your notes." I replied with a thumbs up and a yes. Then I stood by the window and watched the fence in the dusk. I felt calm. Not the kind that comes when a fight is over, but the kind that comes when you know you did the work right and could show it to anyone. I could still hear the clean hum of the string line in my mind. That small, straight song. It was enough for now. It was the following Tuesday when Karen doubled down. I had just returned from a long morning in the field marking out a subdivision line when I saw an unfamiliar sign posted in front of the community center. It read, "Special HOA Safety Session, Wednesday 6 p.m. All residents encouraged to attend." There was no topic listed, but the word safety in a neighborhood where the biggest threats were squirrels in the attic felt like a loaded signal. I stopped by the mailbox and found a glossy flyer tucked inside. The headline read, "Ensuring clear sightlines for a safer neighborhood." Below it was a grainy photo of a fence that looked suspiciously like mine from the angle of the sidewalk. The text underneath warned of potential hazards to drivers and pedestrians from tall obstructions near the road. It was written in the same style as the earlier notices, but with more dramatic language. I could practically hear Karen's voice in every sentence. I brought it inside and added it to the file. My coffee was still warm, so I sat at the desk and stared at the flyer for a minute. I thought about the language. It wasn't about property lines anymore. She had shifted the battleground to safety because it was a concept people instinctively support. If you frame anything as a safety concern, you can get people to agree before they've even asked for proof. That afternoon, I called Joel. He answered with a weary sigh, like he already knew why I was calling. He confirmed that Karen had requested the session to discuss what she called emerging hazards in the neighborhood. He also confirmed that while the meeting was open to everyone, it wasn't an official board vote. That was some comfort, but I knew the purpose wasn't a vote. It was theatre. She wanted an audience, and she wanted to set the scene with herself as the watchful protector. I decided not to skip it. In fact, I decided to attend prepared. I pulled the municipal code section on fence heights and sight lines. I printed diagrams showing how sight triangles are measured at intersections and driveways. I even printed aerial photos of our street, showing that my fence was nowhere near either. I wanted to be ready to answer every question calmly and with facts. The next day, the weather was warm and clear. By the time I walked into the community center at 5:45, the chairs were already half full. Karen stood near the front speaking to a small cluster of neighbors. She wore a blazer and had a stack of handouts on the table beside her. She glanced at me once and then turned away as if I were part of the furniture. I took a seat in the middle row. Tim sat 2 chairs over and leaned toward me. "She's really pulling out the stops," he whispered. "There's even a slideshow." I smiled and said I wasn't surprised. At 6 sharp, Karen stepped to the front and began. She thanked everyone for coming and launched into a presentation about the importance of clear sight lines for neighborhood safety. She clicked through slides, showing generic stock images of children playing near fences and cars turning blind corners. Each point was delivered with the rhythm of someone who had rehearsed. She didn't mention my name, but one of the slides was a zoomed-in shot of my fence, taken from a low angle to make it look taller than it was. When she finished her main points, she invited questions. A man in the back asked how many incidents had been reported in our neighborhood related to sightline obstructions. Karen hesitated just a fraction before saying that while none had been officially recorded, the potential was always there. Another woman asked if the HOA had authority to remove hazards even if they complied with city code. Karen said that the board had broad discretion to preserve safety and aesthetics. I raised my hand. When she called on me, I stood and thanked her for her concern for safety. Then I said I wanted to share some information that might be helpful. I held up the diagram showing the official sight triangle measurement used in our city and explained how it was applied. I pointed out that my fence sat well outside any area that could obstruct a driver's view. I then held up the aerial photo showing the clear path from every driveway and sidewalk corner near my property. A few people leaned forward. One man asked if that meant there was no safety issue at all. I said that based on the city's own criteria, there was no measurable hazard from my fence. I added that I would gladly accommodate changes if evidence showed otherwise, but that none had been presented. Karen tried to steer it back by saying that safety wasn't always about strict measurements, but about how people felt in their environment. I agreed that feelings matter, but said that in disputes involving property rights and structural changes, feelings have to be supported by facts. Otherwise, anyone could force a neighbor to remove something simply by claiming discomfort. The room was quiet for a beat. Then Joel spoke up from the back. He said that while the HOA valued proactive safety measures, it also recognized the limits of its authority and the importance of relying on objective standards. He thanked both of us for presenting our information and suggested that the discussion end there. Karen didn't like that. She moved to the table and started handing out her flyers again. A few people took them politely. Others shook their heads. Tim caught my eye and mouthed, "You won that round." I didn't answer. After the meeting, Karen left quickly. I lingered to chat with a couple of neighbors who had questions about how property lines and sight lines were actually determined. One of them asked if I would be willing to explain the process at a future HOA meeting just for general knowledge. I said I'd be happy to. Education was always better than rumor. When I got home, I walked the fence line with the flashlight. Not because I expected to find anything wrong, but because it had become my habit after these encounters. The posts stood straight. The panels were clean. The gravel edging was still neat. As I locked the gate, I thought about how Karen's persistence wasn't really about winning anymore. It was about keeping the spotlight. Some people can't stand to fade into the background once they've been center stage. That meant this wasn't the last attempt. It just meant she'd have to find a new angle. 2 nights later, I found out what it was. My camera alert buzzed just after 11. I checked the feed and saw a figure standing near the back corner of my yard on the sidewalk side. The person bent down briefly and then walked away. In the morning, I found a laminated card tied to the fence with string. It was another flyer about safety, but this one had a handwritten note on the back. It read, "Just because you can doesn't mean you should." I took a photo of it before removing it and adding it to the file. I didn't reply. I didn't mention it online. I just kept it. Proof speaks louder than protest. That weekend, the weather turned cooler. I spent Saturday cleaning the garage and fixing a loose shutter. From the driveway, I could see Karen's house. Her blinds were open, but I didn't see her. It was the first day in weeks she hadn't passed my property at least once. I didn't believe it meant she'd given up. It probably meant she was planning. And I was fine with that. Planning was slow. I could wait. That night I sat at the desk and flipped through the file. Every note, every photo, every letter. The story was all there in black and white. If it ever came to more than neighbor politics, I was ready. And if it didn't, I still had my fence and my peace. For now. The first sign that Karen wasn't finished came on a Wednesday morning just after sunrise. I was leaving for a site inspection when I saw a small tripod set up on the strip of grass between the sidewalk and the street in front of my property. At first I thought maybe one of the city crews was doing utility work, but then I saw her. Karen was standing a few feet away with her arms folded while another man adjusted the tripod. It wasn't survey gear. It was a camera. She didn't say good morning. She just nodded toward the man and told me he was there to document the fence for what she called an independent review. I asked who was conducting the review. She smiled in a way that said she liked keeping me guessing. I told her as long as they stayed off my property, they could take all the photos they wanted. The man snapped a few shots from different angles and packed up. Karen lingered as if she was waiting for me to ask more questions. I didn't. I got in the truck and drove away. By the time I returned that afternoon, there was an envelope wedged in the door. Inside was a letter on stationery from a private mediation firm. It stated that a neighbor had requested mediation over a dispute concerning a potential encroachment and sightline hazard. It offered a list of available dates for an initial session. The request wasn't mandatory, but the language was crafted to make it sound like refusal would look bad. I set the letter on my desk and let it sit while I made coffee. Mediation can be useful when there's a real disagreement about facts, but here the facts had already been established in a board hearing and verified on site. This wasn't about resolving a dispute. It was about creating the appearance of one. Still, I called Joel. He sighed when I explained. He said the board wasn't involved and that Karen was acting on her own. He told me it was my choice, but he doubted anything good would come from another round of back and forth in front of a stranger. That night I wrote a polite email declining the mediation and stating that the matter had been resolved through the HOA's own process. I copied Joel and attached the board's original decision for reference. I kept the tone light and factual. The next morning my phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood page. Karen had posted a long message about how some residents refused reasonable opportunities to resolve concerns peacefully. She didn't use my name, but she didn't have to. The comment section lit up. Some people echoed her call for neighborly compromise. Others reminded her that the board had already ruled on the matter. Tim jumped in and wrote that dragging the same issue through new venues over and over wasn't compromise. It was harassment. That drew a dozen likes. I stayed out of it. I had learned that the quickest way to lose control of a situation like this was to start defending yourself in a public thread. It turns into a game of snippets and screenshots where tone can be twisted. My record spoke for itself. Over the next week, Karen shifted tactics. She started walking her dog along my property line at odd hours, early in the morning, late at night, always slow enough to take a good look at the fence. Once I saw her stop and jot something in a small notebook. The camera caught her twice, bending slightly toward the hedge, as if measuring with her eyes. I didn't confront her. I just saved the clips. On Friday afternoon, I came home to find a bright orange card taped to my mailbox. It was a city code inspection notice. My stomach tightened until I read the fine print. The inspection wasn't for the fence. It was for alleged overgrowth near the sidewalk. That was laughable. My hedge was trimmed so clean it could have been in a landscaping ad. Still, I called the number on the card. The inspector on the other end sounded apologetic. He said a complaint had been filed and that he was required to take a look. We set a time for the next morning. When he arrived, he walked the length of the hedge with his clipboard. He measured from the outermost leaves to the edge of the sidewalk. He took a photo. Then he shook his head and said everything was well within code. He closed the file and left with a quick wave. I thanked him and added his business card to my growing folder. That evening, Joel called. He said he'd heard from 2 other board members that Karen had been hinting she might take legal action if the board didn't revisit the fence decision. He told me there was no appetite for reopening it. He also told me to expect that she might try something bigger to force the issue. Bigger could mean anything. By Sunday, I had my answer. I woke to the sound of voices outside and stepped onto the porch. Karen was standing on the sidewalk with two men in polo shirts, embroidered with the name of a local surveying company. They had a GPS rover pole and a data collector, real survey equipment. I recognized the company. I'd worked alongside them on commercial projects. I walked over and greeted them by name. One of them smiled sheepishly. He said they'd been hired to confirm a residential boundary, but that they'd need permission to set up on the property. I asked who hired them. He nodded toward Karen. I told him I respected their work, but that any survey on my property would require my consent or a court order. He agreed and said they'd stay on the public right-of-way. Karen looked annoyed but didn't argue. They spent about 20 minutes taking shots from the street side. I knew it wouldn't tell them much without access to the control points in my yard. When they finished, one of them gave me a small nod that told me he understood the game. That afternoon, I emailed the company's owner. I explained the situation and attached the HOA's decision, along with the city plat. I made it clear that I respected their professionalism, but wanted to ensure no data from partial access was misrepresented. He replied within an hour, assuring me they would note the limitations of their work in any report. That was enough for me. Over the next few days, Karen was quieter. No new posts, no flyers. But the quiet didn't feel like retreat. It felt like the pause before a bigger move. I decided to get ahead of it. I scheduled a full survey of my property by a colleague I trusted completely. We marked every corner, shot every line, and tied the measurements directly to the recorded monuments. I had the report notarized and printed in triplicate. One copy went into my file. One went to Joel. One stayed in my truck. 2 nights later, as I was locking up, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. It stayed there for nearly half an hour. The driver never got out. Eventually, it rolled away slowly. The camera caught the license plate. I didn't recognize it. I knew this had gone beyond a simple neighbor disagreement. It had become a contest of endurance. Karen was betting that if she kept the pressure on long enough, I'd give in just to make it stop. What she didn't understand was that patience was my job. I could wait out a 3-month subdivision approval. I could wait out seasonal weather delays. I could certainly wait out her. That night I walked the fence line one more time. The wood was solid. The posts were true. The ground was firm beneath my boots. I thought about the first day she knocked on my door and told me to tear it down. I thought about every step since. And I thought about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that no matter how many angles she tried, the line was still the line. It was a quiet Thursday morning when the big reveal began to take shape. I was working in the garage when my phone buzzed with an email from Joel. The subject line read, "Urgent board inquiry." The body was short. Karen had submitted what she called definitive proof that my fence was in violation. She had requested an emergency board session for Saturday afternoon and invited several residents to attend as witnesses. Joel didn't say what the proof was. He just asked if I could be there and bring any relevant documentation. I stepped back from the workbench and stared at the email for a few seconds. This was the move she'd been winding up for. She thought she had something that could overturn the board's decision. I could almost see her in her kitchen rehearsing the moment she'd drop whatever it was on the table and wait for the room to react. That night I organized my file again. Certified plat on top, full survey report next, photos of each corner stake, city inspection approval, camera footage of anyone near the property line without permission. I even printed the municipal code sections on sightlines and fence height. If she wanted a scene, I would bring the entire stage. Saturday arrived, clear and cool. By the time I walked into the community center, the air in the room was charged. Karen was seated at the front with a large poster board propped against the table. It was covered in aerial images of the neighborhood, highlighted in bright marker. Next to her was a folder thick with papers. A few neighbors were already seated in the rows behind the board table. Tim caught my eye and gave a nod. Greg opened the session and reminded everyone that the previous ruling had found no violation, but that the board had agreed to hear new evidence. Karen stood with deliberate slowness, smoothed the front of her blouse, and stepped to the poster board. She tapped one of the aerial photos. "This," she said, "is the official county imagery from last month." She traced a line in red that ran just outside my fence. According to her, this line represented the true property boundary. She said she had confirmed it with a third-party review and that it proved my fence sat over the line by several inches. The board members leaned forward. Karen held up a sheet that looked like a printout from an online mapping service. She said it was generated using county GIS data and that the measurements were accurate to the inch. I knew exactly what it was. Public mapping tools were useful for general reference, but they were never accurate enough for legal boundary determination. The imagery could be off by several feet depending on the year and the base map. When she finished her presentation, Greg looked at me. I stood, carried my folder to the front, and asked if I could use the easel. I clipped up the certified plat, large enough for everyone to see, and pointed to the coordinates for each corner monument. I explained how GIS imagery is geo-referenced for broad use, but is not tied to the survey-grade control used for legal property lines. I held up the full survey report from my colleague showing each measured point tied directly to the monuments in the plat. Then I placed two photos side by side. One was of the rebar cap in the front corner of my property. The other was the same cap with the GPS rover pole from my colleague's survey, the coordinates displayed on the collector screen. I explained that this data was accurate to within a quarter inch, not several feet. I looked at Joel and asked him if he remembered seeing that same stake during the board's site visit. He nodded. Karen interrupted to say that my surveyor was biased because I knew him. I agreed that I knew him, but pointed out that the methods and results could be verified by any licensed professional. I then held up an email from the owner of the survey company she had hired for the street-side shots. In it, he clearly stated that their measurements were limited by lack of access to the control points and could not be used to make a legal determination. Joel read it aloud for the room. The air shifted. People in the back began murmuring. Tim sat with his arms crossed, watching Karen. She tried to steer the conversation back to sightlines and safety, but Greg cut in. He said the issue before them was whether new evidence proved the original ruling wrong. Based on what he'd heard so far, the evidence was not conclusive. I decided to close with something visual. I pulled out the laminated aerial photo of the neighborhood from the city's own engineering department, the one overlaid with both the GIS line and the actual surveyed line from the plat. The difference was clear. The GIS line ran at a slight skew, clipping through multiple yards, including mine, but the surveyed line matched the monuments exactly and kept the fence inside. I set it on the table where the board could lean in. Karen stared at it without speaking. She didn't reach for the pointer she'd been using earlier. Greg asked if she had any final comments. She said only that she would continue to monitor the situation for the good of the neighborhood. The board stepped into the office to deliberate. This time they were gone less than 10 minutes. When they returned, Greg announced that the new evidence was insufficient to overturn the prior ruling. The fence remained compliant. He added that the board would not entertain further complaints on the same issue unless supported by a licensed survey with full property access. The room was quiet except for the scrape of chairs as people began to stand. Karen gathered her papers quickly. She didn't look at me as she left. Tim walked up and said, "I think that's game." I told him I wasn't ready to call it yet. Outside, the air felt lighter. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk watching neighbors drift to their cars. A few stopped to say they appreciated how I explained things clearly. One woman said she'd learned more about property boundaries in 20 minutes than she had in 20 years of home ownership. That felt like its own quiet win. When I got home, I set the folder on my desk and poured a glass of water. I thought about the way Karen's face had changed when the surveyor's email was read aloud. It was the look of someone realizing their strongest card wasn't as strong as they thought. But I also knew that someone with her stubbornness rarely quits entirely. She'd have to decide whether pushing again would make her look determined or just make her look small. That night I walked the fence line with the flashlight, not because I was worried, but because I wanted to feel that same steadiness I'd carried into the meeting. Each post was solid. Each panel was clean. The ground was firm. I paused at the front corner and looked toward the street. For the first time in weeks, there was no SUV idling, no camera flash, no figure with a clipboard. Just the still night and the soft hum of crickets. I knew the quiet might not last, but for now, the line had held. The quiet held for 3 days before the neighborhood began to rearrange itself. It was subtle at first. The way conversations shifted on the sidewalk. The way people paused a beat longer before choosing which direction to walk. On Monday morning, I was rolling the trash bin to the curb when Mrs. Patel from the corner slowed near the hedge and asked how it all ended. I told her the board kept the original ruling. She nodded with relief, like someone who had been holding her breath since spring. She said the flyers had made her nervous and that she missed when neighbors borrowed sugar instead of accusations. I laughed and said I had sugar if she needed any. She smiled and kept walking. By afternoon, 3 different people stopped to ask about property lines. A young couple who had just moved in wanted to know how to read a plat. An older man asked if survey stakes could really be trusted after 30 years. I explained each answer in regular words and pointed at the fence as a living example. Tim wandered over with his dog and listened with the relaxed grin of someone who had picked a side and saw it pay off. Karen stayed invisible for a while. Her blinds were often closed. The white SUV did not appear in front of my house anymore. The neighborhood page fell quiet. For a second, I wondered if that was it. If the storm had finally spent itself and moved on. Then Joel forwarded an email from the board mailbox that changed the mood. The email was from a resident 2 streets over who said he felt pressured by Karen to sign a letter demanding the board replace its president over the fence decision. He said she had knocked on his door twice in one day and insinuated that those who hesitated would be seen as unfriendly to community standards. He attached the letter with a list of names at the bottom. Some were familiar. Others surprised me. Joel wrote that this was getting out of hand. He said the board planned to address it at the next monthly meeting and asked if I could attend as a witness in case the fence came up again. I said I would. That meeting was different from the others. It was crowded in a way that made the air hum. Greg called it to order, and before he could finish the agenda, Karen stood and announced a motion of no confidence in the board's leadership. The room rustled like leaves. She held up the letter and began to read. People shifted in their chairs. The words landed heavy and then sank. When she finished, a man in the front row raised his hand and asked what any of this had to do with a fence that had already been ruled compliant. Karen said it was about a pattern of lax enforcement. He asked for examples. She hesitated and cited a Halloween decoration guideline from 2 years earlier that no one remembered. A woman near the aisle said she did remember and that the board had handled it fine. Greg thanked everyone and said the board would stick to the posted agenda. He opened public comment. Tim stood and spoke in a clear voice about neighborliness and respecting due process. Another resident said that constant petitions and special sessions were tearing at the calm that had made this street worth moving to. Joel added gently that volunteers on the board were not paid to be the target of every frustration. The room grew still. Finally, Greg said the motion of no confidence would not be recognized without proper procedure and that the board would accept nominations at the regular time in the fall like always. He moved the meeting along. Karen sat slowly and stared at nothing. Fallout looked like little things after that. The couple across from Karen stopped waving when she passed. The kids who used to cut across her lawn to retrieve a soccer ball began walking a wider circle. People who once took her side in every thread started skipping the comments when she posted. It was not shunning so much as fatigue. Neighbors wanted to talk about cookouts and school supplies and the new bakery opening by the highway. They did not want to litigate a fence for the rest of the year. I tried not to celebrate that shift. It is easy to confuse relief with gloating. Instead, I kept my routine steady. I watered the rosemary. I mowed on Fridays. I waved at everyone. I planted 3 small shrubs along the public side of the fence, because I had promised I would consider softening the look, and because I meant it. Tim helped me dig the holes. He joked that we should name them after legal concepts. I said we would call them patience, clarity, and good faith. He laughed and said good faith looked healthiest. 2 weeks later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox without a stamp. Inside was a note written in neat, careful letters. It said thank you for handling the situation with calm and for explaining things. It was signed with initials I did not recognize. No return address. I set it on my desk and left it there like a small stone that anchored a stack of papers. There were ripples I could not see at first. Joel told me quietly that the board had received a handful of complaints about Karen's door-to-door campaigns and the tone of her messages. Nothing formal. Just people saying they felt cornered in their own driveways. The board decided to draft a new policy about communication etiquette and to remind everyone that volunteers were neighbors first. Joel sent me the draft to read. It was simple and kind and firm. One evening I was raking leaves when I noticed Karen standing at the end of her walkway. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but like a person who had run out of air. She watched me for a moment and then looked away as a car drove past. I thought about walking over. I thought about saying something that might ease whatever it was inside her, that needed everything to be under control. I did not. I was not the right person to deliver that message. I was the person who had stood on the other side of her argument and won. Anything I said would sound like victory no matter how softly I wrapped it. That weekend, the neighborhood held a small block gathering at the cul-de-sac. Folding tables, crock-pots, kids on scooters. It was the kind of event that smells like slow-cooked meat and sunscreen. I brought a tray of roasted vegetables and a couple of bottles of sparkling water. Tim manned the grill with 2 other guys. Greg arrived with a box of name tags that nobody used. Karen stayed away. People noticed and then moved on. A few asked me about the shrubs, and I said they would fill in by spring and make a neat green line. Someone asked if I would do a short talk about reading plats at the next meeting. I said yes. As the sun slipped behind the houses, the conversation turned easy. A neighbor I barely knew told me he had spent a decade in a condo with a combative board, and that these past months had given him flashbacks. He said he was grateful that the board had held firm, and that a resident had handled the pressure with grace. I told him that grace is easier when you have a file full of receipts. He laughed and raised his paper cup. It could have ended there. A steady ride into autumn with fewer emails and more calm. But one night my camera pinged again, and when I checked the feed, I saw 2 teenagers with hoodies pulled up sprinting past my hedge. One of them tossed something small at the fence. It thunked against the wood and bounced into the grass. A tiny plastic ball. They kept running. I was about to let it go when a second clip caught my eye. A few minutes later, Karen stepped onto the sidewalk and looked down at the ball. She picked it up and tossed it into the trash can at the curb. Then she stood there a long time, staring at the fence like it was a mirror reflecting something she did not want to see. The next morning I found a scuff on one panel where the ball had hit. Nothing serious. I wiped it with a damp cloth and it vanished. As I worked, I saw Karen watching from her yard. For a second I considered walking over to tell her I appreciated that she had tossed the trash. She turned away before I decided. A few days later, Joel asked me to join a small committee to draft clearer guidelines for future disputes. He wanted someone who understood both the technical side and the human side. I hesitated. Being in the room again with Karen felt like inviting static back into my speakers. But this was the kind of work that prevented the next fight from becoming a saga. I agreed. The first committee meeting was held in the library corner of the community center. Joel was there, along with a teacher who lived 2 doors down and a retiree who had served on city councils in another state. Karen arrived late and took a seat at the far end of the table. She did not make eye contact. Joel laid out the goals, clear procedures for complaints, clear expectations for evidence. A reminder that private property rights were not optional. He asked me to walk through a simple outline of how a plat and a survey connected. I kept it short and used the room's whiteboard to draw 2 squares with marked points. I did not mention the fence. Karen spoke only once. She suggested a clause that allowed the committee to act quickly in emergencies. The retiree asked what qualified as an emergency. She said sightline hazards. He nodded and said genuine hazards should be handled by the city first because they have authority and experts. She pressed her lips together and said nothing else. After the meeting, she lingered near the door while the others left. For a moment, it was just the 2 of us. The fluorescent lights hummed. I waited. She cleared her throat and said the board embarrassed her when they read that email from the survey company. She said she felt undermined. I told her I understood what it felt like to be convinced of something and then watch the facts point another way. I said that it happened to me on jobs and that it never felt good. I also said the facts still mattered. She nodded once. Then she said her mother had been ill and that managing the neighborhood gave her something to control. I said I was sorry to hear about her mother. The words were simple. They were all I had. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and left without looking back. After that, the temperature dropped again. Her posts slowed. The white SUV did not circle. The door knocking stopped. I would catch glimpses of her in the morning walking the dog with a softer gait. When we passed on the sidewalk, we nodded. Not friends, not enemies, just neighbors with history. In late afternoon sun, I watered the new shrubs and watched the light catch on the leaves. The fence cast clean shadows. A blue jay landed on the top rail and tilted its head like it was inspecting my work. I thought about how drama swells and then recedes and how communities keep moving forward in the quiet hours nobody posts about. A line holds because people agree to hold it together. And when one person pushes too hard, the rest lean back just enough to keep it from sliding. Autumn crept in. The air turned sharper at night. The neighborhood page filled with photos of pumpkins and football flags. The board published the new dispute policy and a short note about kindness in communication. It was plain and good. A week later, I hosted a small evening on my driveway with coffee and pie and invited anyone who wanted to drop by. People came and told stories, and nobody mentioned the fence until a kid asked if it would be tall enough to block the wind for his paper airplane contest. I told him it would, and we tested that theory right there. As the last cup was tossed and the stars came out, I felt the neighborhood settle into itself again. Not perfect, not without memory, just steady. The fallout had landed and become part of the ground we all stood on. The fence stood where it had always stood, and the line we had been fighting over returned to its quiet job of keeping the peace. Winter came early that year, with a wind sharp enough to turn the sidewalks into quiet places where people hurried instead of lingered. The leaves were gone from the shrubs I'd planted along the fence, their bare branches etched like careful lines against the pale boards. Most days I worked long hours in the field, surveying sites where frost clung to the ground until midday. In the evenings I'd come home to a neighborhood that felt softer than it had in months, the noise of the fence saga replaced by the muffled sounds of heaters and the occasional bark of a dog. Karen had mostly disappeared from view. I'd see her car in the driveway or a light in her front room, but she no longer made her presence felt in the ways she used to. No flyers, no early morning walks to measure imaginary lines, no SUV idling at the corner. When we did cross paths, she would nod once and keep moving. It wasn't friendly exactly, but it wasn't war. In early December, the board hosted a small holiday gathering at the community center. Folding tables held trays of cookies, thermoses of hot cocoa, and stacks of paper plates. A Christmas tree leaned slightly in one corner, its lights blinking in slow rhythm. I stood near the coffee urn talking to Tim when Karen walked in. She was alone, wearing a dark coat and holding a small foil-wrapped plate. She scanned the room, and for a second her eyes caught mine. She didn't look away, but she didn't smile either. The evening passed without incident. People chatted about holiday plans, kids ran circles around the tables, and someone started a small caroling group by the door. Karen kept mostly to herself. As I was leaving, I felt a light tap on my arm. She stood there holding the foil plate. She said, "These are almond cookies. My mother used to make them. I thought you might like them." Her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I took the plate and said thank you. She nodded once and turned away before I could say anything else. At home, I set the cookies on the counter and stared at them for a moment before unwrapping the foil. They were small, dusted with powdered sugar, and still faintly warm. I ate one, then another, then covered the rest. They tasted like something handed down over years, the kind of recipe that lives in someone's memory longer than in a book. The next week, the board's new dispute policy went into effect. It was simple. Any complaint about a neighbor's property had to be backed by a clear reference to the covenants and, if relevant, evidence from a qualified source. No more public accusations without proof. No more endless revisiting of resolved matters. Joel asked if I would help explain the new rules at the January meeting, just as an example of why they mattered. I agreed. That January night, the meeting was calm. I stood by the whiteboard and walked through a short outline of how the process worked, using general examples that had nothing to do with fences. Karen sat in the back, listening but not speaking. When the meeting ended, she walked past me without a word, but her expression was unreadable. By February, the neighborhood felt settled again. People were talking about spring projects and summer vacations. My shrubs had started to bud early in the mild winter air. One Saturday morning, I was trimming them when Karen stopped on the sidewalk. She pointed at the green shoots and said they'd look nice in a year or two. I told her that was the plan. She stood there for a moment like she might say more, but instead she just nodded and walked on. Life kept moving. Work pulled me into new parts of the city. The days grew longer. I saw Karen less often, though sometimes her dog would glance toward my yard as they passed. Ears pricked like it remembered the tension. The fence remained where it was, unchanged and unchallenged, doing the quiet work fences are meant to do. One evening in late spring, I found a letter in my mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA or the city. It was from Karen. The handwriting was careful. She wrote that she wanted to acknowledge the trouble she'd caused, that she had believed she was protecting the neighborhood, but had let that belief push her too far. She wrote that she knew I had every right to be angry, but hoped that, in time, we could be simply neighbors again. It wasn't long, but it was clear. I read it twice, then folded it and set it in the same file where I'd kept every piece of paper from the saga. It felt right to keep it there, not as evidence this time, but as part of the story. I didn't write back. Some things don't need a reply. That summer, the neighborhood had its first real block party in years. Kids filled the street with bikes and chalk drawings. Music floated from a portable speaker. Someone grilled burgers. Someone else brought a tub of ice filled with sodas. I moved between conversations, laughing with people I'd barely spoken to before the fence fight. At one point, I saw Karen standing near the food table talking to Mrs. Patel. She glanced my way and gave the faintest smile. I raised my cup slightly. She returned the gesture. By autumn, the shrubs had grown enough to soften the fence line. People stopped asking about the dispute entirely. New residents moved in and never knew there had been a battle at all. That was the way of neighborhoods time, and new stories pushed the old ones to the edges. Looking back, I realized it wasn't just about a fence. It was about the slow work of standing your ground without burning it, about knowing when to speak and when to let silence carry the weight, about remembering that a property line isn't just a mark in the soil, it's an agreement between people to live side by side without pushing each other over. One crisp evening, nearly a year after the first knock on my door, I walked the line again. The fence was the same. The ground was firm. The shrubs were full. Across the street, lights flickered on in windows as dinner plates clinked. I thought about all the hours I had spent defending something that, in the end, had not moved an inch. And I thought about how sometimes the best revenge is nothing dramatic, just living well within the boundaries you know are yours. As the sun dipped and the sky shifted to deep blue, I leaned against the fence for a moment, listening to the quiet. The battle was over. The line held, and so did I.